There is a sound that still wakes me up at night. Not a scream, not a slam, just a drawer sliding open, slow and careful, the way you open something when you don't want anyone to hear. My name is Mara, and for 3 years, I was married to a man I thought I understood completely. I was wrong. I didn't understand him at all. I didn't even understand the woman who raised him, the woman who smiled at me across Thanksgiving tables, who called me sweetheart in that soft, syrupy voice, who hugged me a little too long every time we said goodbye. It was my mother-in-law, Evelyn, and she was the reason my marriage nearly destroyed me. But I didn't know that, not for the longest time. I want to tell you how it started, because it didn't start with anything you'd call a warning sign. It started with something small, something almost forgettable. Daniel and I met at a mutual friend's engagement party 4 years before everything fell apart. He was funny in that quiet way, the kind of funny that sneaks up on you after the third or fourth conversation. He remembered things, little things. What I ordered at dinner, the name of my childhood dog that I hated when people chewed with their mouths open. "You're the first person who's ever noticed that about me," I told him once, maybe 6 months in. "I notice everything about you," he said, and I believed him. God, I believed him completely. We got married on a Saturday in October. Under string lights his mother insisted on hanging herself. I remember thinking, at the time, how sweet that was, how involved she wanted to be. I didn't know yet that involved and controlling can wear the exact same face. The first year of marriage was, I want to be honest here, it was good. Not perfect. No marriage is perfect, but good. We laughed a lot. We fought about normal things, dishes, money, whose turn it was to call the landlord. Nothing that scared me. It was in the second year that things began to shift. Slowly. So slowly I almost couldn't feel it happening, like a tide pulling out further than you realize until you look up and the shore is gone. It started with silence. Daniel would come home from his mother's house. He visited her every Sunday, had done so his whole life, and I never thought twice about it, and he'd be different. Quieter. Colder. Like something had been poured into him that hadn't been there when he left that morning. "How was your mom?" I'd ask. "Fine," he'd say, just that, fine. But his jaw would be tight. And later that night, over something meaningless, I left a light on, I forgot to defrost the chicken. His voice would rise in a way I hadn't heard before. I told myself it was stress. His job was demanding. I told myself a lot of things. The first time he grabbed my arm hard enough to leave a mark, I stood in the bathroom afterward staring at my own reflection, and I didn't cry. I just felt this strange, quiet disbelief, like I was watching someone else's life through a window. He apologized. Of course he apologized. He always did, and beautifully, flowers, tears, his hands shaking as he held mine and told me he didn't know what came over him, that he loved me more than anything, that it would never happen again. And here's the thing nobody tells you about that kind of apology. You want so badly to believe it that you help him make the case for himself. So I stayed. It happened again, and again. Never something I could point to and say, look here, this is proof. It was always careful, always contained, always followed by an explanation that almost made sense if I didn't examine it too closely. A grip on my wrist, a hand against my chest, pushing me back a step. Words that cut somewhere deeper than any bruise could reach. What confused me, what still confuses me when I look back, is the timing. It was never random. It was always after Sundays. Always after he'd spent the afternoon at his mother's house, in that immaculate living room with the porcelain figurines and the smell of lemon polish, drinking tea from cups that had been in her family for generations. I started dreading Sundays the way you dread a storm you can see building on the horizon, but can't do anything to stop. "Evelyn, is everything okay between you and Daniel?" I asked her once, carefully, over coffee. I thought maybe there was tension I didn't know about. Maybe he was hiding something from her too. She looked at me with those pale blue eyes, so calm, so composed, and she patted my hand. "Marriage is hard, dear," she said. "You just have to learn to give him space. Men need space. You hold on too tight." I remember nodding. I remember thinking, she's right, maybe I am too much, maybe I ask too many questions, maybe I need him too much and that's the problem. It's strange, isn't it, how easily we can be turned against ourselves. I didn't tell anyone what was happening at home. Not my sister, not my closest friend, not even my own mother. Shame has a way of sealing your mouth shut. You start believing that if you say the words out loud, they'll become more true than they already are. So I stayed silent, and I stayed small, and I stayed in a house that had slowly stopped feeling like mine. There were nights I'd lie awake beside him, listening to him breathe, and I'd think, I don't know this man anymore. Or worse, I never did. Then, in March, almost 3 years into the marriage, Daniel left for a work conference. 4 days away. And Evelyn called me, which she almost never did. We mostly just saw each other at family things, and asked if I could stop by her house to pick up a package that had been mistakenly delivered there for Daniel. It's on the top shelf of his old closet, she said. I'd get it myself, but my knees, you know how they are. I remember standing in that closet, in the house Daniel grew up in, surrounded by boxes of his childhood, yearbooks, trophies, a stack of birthday cards tied with ribbon. And on the top shelf, behind an old winter coat, I found a shoebox. It wasn't the package I'd come for. That was on the shelf below it, exactly where she said. But something about the shoebox stopped me. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe some part of me already knew, on some level beneath language, that my whole life was about to split into a before and an after. I reached up, I pulled it down, and I opened it. Inside were letters, dozens of them. In Evelyn's handwriting, dated across the last 3 years, the exact 3 years of my marriage. I sat down on the floor of that closet, and I started to read. And with every line, I felt the floor of my entire life tilt beneath me. The first letter was dated almost exactly 1 month after our wedding. Daniel, it began, you sound distracted lately, distant. I hope you're not letting yourself get soft. You know what happened to your father when he let a woman walk all over him. I raised you better than that. I remember reading it twice because I couldn't understand what I was looking at. Then I opened the next one, and the next. They weren't ordinary letters. They were instructions, disguised as motherly advice, wrapped in that same syrupy voice she used across the dinner table, but underneath the softness was something colder, something deliberate. If she raises her voice to you, don't just stand there. A man who doesn't respond is a man who gets walked on. You let her talk to you like that in front of me last Sunday. I didn't raise a doormat. She needs to understand who's in charge in that house. Gently, at first, but she needs to understand it. Page after page, year after year. A slow, patient campaign, mailed and handed to him every single Sunday, tucked inside cards, folded into birthday notes, slipped into his coat pocket when she thought no one was looking. I sat on that closet floor for what felt like an hour, maybe longer. My hands were shaking so hard the pages rattled. Because here is what broke something in me, more than anything else, more than the bruises, more than the fear, more than 3 years of wondering what was wrong with me. It wasn't just that Daniel had hurt me. It was that someone had built him into a man capable of it, brick by brick, letter by letter. And she'd done it while smiling at me, while hugging me, while calling me sweetheart in that same soft voice she used to write the words, she needs to understand who's in charge. I don't remember driving home. I remember standing in my own kitchen holding that shoebox against my chest like it was something that might disappear if I let go of it. Daniel called that night from his hotel room. His voice was warm, easy, completely unaware. "Hey, miss you already," he said. "How's everything?" I almost couldn't speak. "I went to your mom's today," I finally said, "to pick up your package." There was a pause, just half a second, but I heard it. "Oh yeah, everything okay?" "I found a shoebox, Daniel, in your old closet." The silence that followed lasted longer than any silence I had ever heard from him. I could hear him breathing on the other end, and somewhere underneath that breathing, I could hear the sound of a man realizing the walls he'd built his whole life around were coming down. "Mara," he said finally, his voice smaller than I'd ever heard it, "I can explain." Then explain, I said. Explain 3 years of letters telling you how to control your own wife. He didn't say anything for a long time. And then, quietly, almost like a confession he'd been carrying so long it had become part of his skeleton, he said, I didn't know how to stop listening to her. I've never known how. My whole life, she's been the loudest voice in every room I've ever stood in. I wanted to feel sorry for him. Some small, exhausted part of me did. But a larger part of me, a part that had been silent for 3 years, finally found its voice. That doesn't excuse what you did to me, I said. You're a grown man. She didn't put her hands on me. You did. He came home 2 days later than planned. I don't know if it was shame or cowardice or some combination of both that made him delay it. When he finally walked through the door, he looked like he'd aged 5 years in 4 days. We sat across from each other at the kitchen table, the same table where he'd shouted at me more times than I could count. And for the first time since I'd known him, he cried without trying to make it about comforting himself. He cried like someone finally seeing the shape of what he'd become. I'm not going to ask you to stay, he said. I don't think I deserve that. No, I said, you don't. But I want to be honest with you about something, because this story isn't as simple as villain and victim, mother and monster. I didn't leave that night. I didn't leave the next week either, because the human heart doesn't work on the same timeline as good sense. I had loved this man. I had built a life inside these walls. Leaving isn't a single door you walk through, it's 100 small doors, and some days you can only open one. What I did do that same week was call a therapist. Then I called my sister, and for the first time in 3 years I told her everything, all of it. The grip on my wrist, the Sundays, the shoebox. She was quiet on the phone for a moment, and then she said, Mara, I've been waiting 3 years for you to say those words out loud. She'd known, or suspected, and she'd been waiting, patient and heartbroken for the day I'd let her in. I gave Daniel an ultimatum that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with survival. Therapy. Real therapy, not couples counseling to save a marriage, but individual work to undo whatever had been wired into him since childhood. And no contact with his mother. None. Not phone calls, not Sunday visits, not birthday cards. He agreed. I think some part of him was almost relieved, the way you're relieved when a wound finally gets looked at instead of hidden under a bandage for years. It didn't fix everything overnight. I won't tell you it did, because that wouldn't be true, and this story deserves the truth more than it deserves a tidy ending. We separated for 4 months while he worked with a therapist who specialized in family trauma. I moved in with my sister. I learned, slowly, what it felt like to fall asleep without listening for footsteps. Evelyn called me 11 times in those 4 months. I didn't answer once. She showed up at my sister's door on a Tuesday evening in June, dressed impeccably, her voice as calm and sweet as ever. Mara, sweetheart, this is all such a misunderstanding. I only ever wanted what was best for my son's marriage. I looked at her for a long moment, and for the first time in 3 years, I wasn't afraid of her voice. You wanted control, I said, and you got it, but not anymore. I closed the door. It was the last time I ever spoke to her. Daniel and I did eventually find our way back to each other, but not to the marriage we'd had before. We built something new, slower, more honest, with boundaries that hadn't existed in the first version of us. He still goes to therapy every week, even now, 2 years later. He talks about his mother the way you'd talk about a storm you survived, with respect for its power and no desire to ever stand in it again. I kept the shoebox, not the letters, those I burned, one by one in the backyard on a cold November night, watching each page curl and blacken and disappear. But I kept the box itself, empty now, on a shelf in our bedroom. Daniel asked me once why I kept it. Because I never want to forget how close I came to disappearing, I told him. And I never want either of us to forget who almost made that happen. Some people ask me if I regret opening that box that day. I don't. I think, somewhere deep down, some part of me had been looking for that box for 3 years without knowing it existed. Some part of me had been waiting for proof that I wasn't imagining things, that I wasn't too sensitive, too much, too needy, that the voice in my head asking why does this feel wrong had been right all along. If you're listening to this and some quiet part of you recognizes even a piece of what I'm describing, a coldness that follows a certain phone call, a fear that lives in your own home, a voice that isn't yours but somehow controls your Sundays, I want you to hear this clearly. You are not imagining it, and you are not alone. Sometimes the box you're afraid to open is the only thing that can finally set you free.